In 1953, four men walked into the Central National Bank in St. Louis and walked out with $2.7 million, and nobody's ever found most of it. Now, before you dismiss this as just another mid-century robbery, understand what made it different. The men didn't use violence. They didn't crack a vault. They simply walked through the front door in broad daylight, tied up the employees, and emptied the cash drawers while customers watched from the lobby floor. The method was so clean, so methodical, that it became the blueprint for every bank heist movie that followed, and that's where our real mystery begins. Exhibit 1. The crime itself happened on June 17, 1953, at 10:42 a.m. Four men entered the bank. They subdued 8 employees and 3 customers without firing a shot. They used a combination of rope and intimidation, nothing more. In 42 minutes, they'd emptied the vault and the teller drawers, loading $2.7 million into duffel bags. Then they walked out the back door and vanished into the St. Louis heat. You might think the FBI would have cracked this wide open. They did recover about $420,000 in the weeks that followed, cash found buried near the airport, hidden in a basement, stashed in a truck. But here's where the story gets strange. $2.28 million simply disappeared. No arrests were made. No kingpin was ever identified. The case went cold faster than you'd expect for a heist that was, at the time, the largest bank robbery in American history. Exhibit 2, the official explanation. Police arrested a man named Bob Stegeman, a career criminal with connections to St. Louis' underworld. They charged him with the robbery. Stegeman was convicted in 1954 and sentenced to 20 years. The case was closed. The public was satisfied. The newspapers moved on. But there's a problem with this narrative, one that the courtroom testimony itself exposed. During the trial, multiple witnesses testified that they couldn't identify the robbers. The men wore hats, they wore sunglasses, they wore masks. The employees had been looking down at gunpoint, not studying faces. Yet Stegeman was convicted largely on circumstantial evidence. He had money in his possession, and he knew people in the underworld. That's not proof. That's proximity. And skeptics have been questioning it ever since. Exhibit 3, the Hollywood connection. In 1972, a film called The Great St. Louis Bank Robbery was released. It was a fictionalized account, yes, but it was based directly on the 1953 crime. The film became a cult classic. It influenced heist movies for decades. Directors studied it. Screenwriters copied its structure. The irony: the film's narrative, methodical, professional, clean, suggested a level of planning and sophistication that the actual investigation never proved existed. Here's where the skepticism kicks in. The Hollywood version made the robbers look like geniuses. But was that true? Or did the movie's success actually obscure the messiness of the real crime? The fact that nobody really knew who did it, and the conviction of Stegeman, might have been a convenient solution rather than justice. Exhibit 4, the money that vanished. The FBI recovered $420,000, but $2.28 million remained unaccounted for. Where did it go? The official story: the robbers hid it. But if Stegeman was the mastermind and he was arrested just weeks later, where was his cut? Why didn't searchers find it? The money was never discovered because, some theorists argue, it was never really hidden. It was spent, distributed, or laundered through channels that law enforcement never traced. But here's the counter-argument. Stegeman had associates. Organized crime in St. Louis was real. Maybe those associates did hide the money, and it's still out there, sitting in a wall cavity somewhere, waiting for someone to remember where it was buried. Stegeman died in 1992 without ever revealing where the bulk of the cash went. His silence could mean guilt, or it could mean he never knew. Exhibit 5, the alternative theory. Some investigators, decades later, began asking whether the robbery was actually an inside job perpetrated not by outside criminals, but by bank employees themselves. After all, they knew the layout. They knew the security procedures. They knew exactly when the vault would be most vulnerable. The men who robbed the bank moved with the confidence of people who'd studied the place. What if they had? But this theory falls apart under scrutiny. The employees were bound and gagged. They were victims, not conspirators. And yet there's a nagging detail. One of the tellers who survived the robbery unharmed later admitted he'd had financial troubles. Another employee had connections to the underworld. Were they questioned thoroughly? The trial records suggest not. The case moved too fast, closed too neatly. Here's what we know for certain. 4 men robbed the Central National Bank of St. Louis on June 17, 1953. They took $2.7 million. About $420,000 was recovered. The rest vanished. Bob Stegeman was convicted and imprisoned. He died without confessing. No other arrests were ever made for the crime. The case remains technically unsolved. Stegeman's conviction rests on circumstantial evidence that wouldn't survive modern scrutiny. The Hollywood version of this story, the one that inspired decades of heist films, was actually cleaner and more satisfying than the truth. The truth is messier. It's a story about incomplete evidence, convenient arrests, and millions of dollars that might be anywhere or nowhere. It's a reminder that the narratives we tell ourselves about crime are often more fictional than we'd like to admit. The St. Louis bank robbery of 1953 teaches us something crucial about how we investigate fraud and crime. We want closure. We want a villain we can name and a resolution we can understand. So when evidence is ambiguous, we shape it to fit the story we've already decided to believe. That's human nature. But it's also how innocent people get convicted and how guilty people sometimes walk free. 70 years later, the missing $28 million has never been found. Stegeman's grave remains unmarked. The identities of the 3 other robbers remain unknown. And somewhere in St. Louis, in a basement, a wall, a storage unit, or scattered across the country, there might still be duffel bags full of cash from 1953, waiting for someone to remember where they were hidden. Or maybe there isn't. Maybe the money was spent decades ago, distributed to people whose names we'll never know. What we can say with certainty is this: the official story of the St. Louis bank robbery doesn't hold up. The conviction of Bob Stegeman was built on circumstantial evidence that would be challenged immediately in any modern courtroom. The case was closed not because it was solved, but because it was convenient to close it. And the Hollywood version of events, that became more famous than the truth, which is exactly how myths are born from facts. Subscribe. Every week we expose another case where the official story fell apart under real scrutiny.